Okay, what I'll do is I'll introduce each speaker in turn. So our first speaker today is going to be Livy D, who is hi Livy, who is a research associate in oral history at Newcastle University. She's an oral historian of gender, women, politics, and reproductive rights in 20th century England and Northern Ireland. Her recent book, The Anti-Abortion Campaign in England from 1966 to 1989, was published by Routledge last year. She's previously worked on the Mother and Baby Home project at Queen's University Belfast, which I think you're going to hear about today. And she's currently working on the Waste and Strays project, which is at Newcastle University and explores urban commons in England. So I'll let you take it away, Livy.
Okay, thank you. I'll just unmute myself and I'm going to share my screen. So if someone could just let me know if that's worked. Where are we? Great, thank you, Sam. Okay, so thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I am kind of new to the technology, so I'm just going to kind of do my best. I hope that the PowerPoint kind of follows the talk. So yeah, as Sam said, I'm Olivia D. I currently work at Newcastle, but I sort of primarily wanted to talk about my experience on the Northern Ireland Mother and Baby Home and Magdalene Laundry project. We collected about 60 interviews for that project, primarily with women and their family members who had experienced mother and baby homes and Magdalene laundries, specifically in Northern Ireland. But I will talk a tiny bit about the project I'm on now, just because it is interesting to think about how projects are interrupted at the moment. That's the Waste and Strays project. We're aiming to complete about 100 interviews across 4 case studies in England, and that's at Newcastle University. And that project is based on the use of common land and the memories associated with that land, with a kind of view to protecting it for the future. So the first thing that struck me, I suppose, when we heard about coronavirus was that our jobs were obviously going to change almost overnight, especially those of us who are based in kind of community oral history projects. Everything was going to be very different. So I actually had 2 trips already planned, and I'd scheduled 10 interviews to take place the week of the lockdown. And when I cancelled them, it was quite interesting to note that there were very mixed reactions. So I had some people very relieved about the risk to their health and the fact that oral history interviews were perhaps not the best thing to be doing, and they were quite concerned about that. I had some who were like, okay, let's reschedule as soon as this is over. And then I had some who were very skeptical and perhaps thought that maybe we were being a bit over dramatic. And I think, like a lot of us, maybe didn't think this was going to be as long-term or as serious as it was. I only had one person who suggested moving the interview online. It wasn't really something that had come up. And it wasn't something that was suggested by the people that I had been intending to talk to. So there were 3 things that I kind of wanted to consider when I was kind of thinking about this panel. There's 3 areas perhaps with this new way of life that I wanted to think about. So the first one is selection bias and alienation. The second is, how do we avoid / embrace making everything we do now about pre or post COVID? And finally, I wanted to talk about trauma, trust, and building relationships. And that's perhaps where my project in Northern Ireland is a bit more relevant. So basically, I just wanted to quickly touch on each 3 of these, and then maybe revisit them in the discussion, because I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this. But I suppose I'm also really interested in, you know, just thinking about these ideas. I don't have specific answers yet. This is very new, and I'm sure lots of people feel the same way. So in terms of selection bias and alienation, I just wanted to kind of use my experience to talk about that a little bit. So for every woman who found the courage to contact the Northern Ireland Mother and Baby Home project, there was a really complicated mix of circumstances behind their phone call or their email. I had calls where women would just hang up halfway through. They'd speak through tears. They'd talk to me about their experience, and then they'd leave, or they'd tell me that there was someone else coming and they had to go. And largely they tell me that they hadn't really spoken about this to anyone before, and that no one knew about their experience, and they'd heard through the project about, they'd heard about the project through an advert or something in the paper, and they'd kind of psyched themselves up to call it over several months. So what this project really underlined to me is the importance of a safe interview space, whether that is somewhere that we bring them, or whether it's their own home. And that perhaps when discussing trauma, there needs to be a sort of a new or neutral space to think about that. In really blunt terms, many of these women didn't have the luxury of a 2-hour Zoom call in their own homes to discuss secrets that they've kept for 10, 20 or 50 years. So this is where the concept of selection bias or alienation is important. If we move to these new online forms of interviewing or jump too quickly into asking our narrators to share stories through screens, I'm wondering who we alienate and who we lose. Maybe we're asking our narrators of trauma to put their stories into our spaces that they only have a limited view of through their screens. How do we assure them that their stories are safe when they can't sit in a room with us and understand issues of privacy and things like that? Someone could walk in at any time, and although we take precautions to avoid that, it adds an element of distrust or maybe concern. I also wonder how secure people feel with these new technologies when there's Zoom headlines about, things being hijacked or, people's stories being stolen. I just wonder how safe they feel on these new methodologies. In several cases in the Northern Irish project, the women raised concerns over their ability to even use email or text, and instead asked if they could send in their transcripts via post or converse with us through the post. And I wonder maybe whether we overestimate sometimes people's kind of circumstances when it comes to using these technologies. And I thought this quotation was really interesting from Fuchs, who argued that it's been stressed that the digital divide concerns not only the availability of computers, but the required skills for using it and what users do with those computers. And with regards to oral history, I would ask the following questions. Who do we alienate when we move online? Especially when the stories that we're asking people to tell represent years of isolation, with narrators who can't necessarily ask for family help to set up meetings, who might not be able to use these new technologies, and finally might not trust, perhaps with good reason, these platforms that we're asking them to use. So the second thing I was wanting to talk about was this issue of pre and post COVID. So as an oral historian in the current climate, who works on a community project, my current project kind of exemplifies the problems that we have here. Hang on. So I'm looking at these 4 case studies across England, and I've sort of put them here. So there's kind of one in Newcastle, one in Norwich, one in Bristol, and one in Brighton. And I'm supposed to be traveling all over to collect these oral histories. The fact that we were interrupted after the completion of our first case study in Newcastle, and the very swift nature of the lockdown means that we have a quarter completed and 3 quarters still to go. The dilemma we face now involves how we approach the subject of COVID when so many of our projects depend on the experiences of public space. In a time when public space has become very, very important, COVID will now feature very heavily in all of the narratives that we collect from this point onwards. But it's entirely absent from any of our interviews in our first case study, especially since it was so swift and it happened so quickly. There was no even discussion of build-up. It's literally a section of interviews will never reference it, and now from now on, all of our interviews will discuss it. So do we embrace that and write about it, or do we try and cordon it off and move on? If we do 1/4 of the interviews in person and 3/4 online, does that alter the structure and content itself? The very nature of being online, of connecting Zoom calls and using internet and all the problems that come with that will change the dynamic, surely. So it'll be a constant reminder of the current situation. Because of the generous time that this project has, I've made the decision at the moment not to pursue online interviews until we know the time frame. And instead, we've decided to use social media and blogs to try and create communities of potential narrators to sort of generate conversation about our case studies, throughout this period and generate some momentum and try and make sure that the project keeps going and the discussions keep happening. But then try and move back into kind of face-to-face interviewing when this is over, when this is over. So my final thing that I wanted to just mention was this idea of trauma and trust and building relationships. So with the exception of the current project, I've primarily worked in oral histories that deal with privacy and trauma, subjects like abortion, birth control, and then most recently sort of unmarried motherhood and mother and baby homes. And traumatic interviews are made very, very difficult by this current situation. So Emma Vickers has written an excellent article on unexpected trauma, and she uses this definition, which I really found helpful, which was, I define unexpected trauma as moments in which interviewees relate experiences that often have tangential relationships to the stated purpose of the interview, whereas expected trauma is that which occurs in a post-crisis context, or that which arises because the research explicitly asks respondents to focus on that aspect of their experiences. And the way I kind of interpret that is that we have to think about two things. First, the trauma that is implicit in the story and the narratives that we're being told, but the trauma as well of the actual interview itself. So the fact that they've had to come to an interview and relive that, and how we kind of understand that. So during my research with the Northern Ireland Mother and Baby Home project, interviews would typically take all day. And that wasn't necessarily that the interviews would, that we would record them over a whole day. It was that we gave the day to them. So if I traveled to them or if they traveled to us, we would take space around those interviews to meet, to talk, to make sure that there was no time limit on the interview, so they didn't feel they were being rushed or stressed about kind of managing to get the right interview done in time. And I think it's really important that as oral historians, we allow respondents to tell us their limitations, but also to speak on things that they've never had the chance to discuss, even if it wasn't necessarily what we had expected the interview to be about. So to construct these valuable oral histories, we have to invest in building relationships with the narrators, so that we build the project together rather than simply reinforcing a dynamic of interviewer and interviewee. And when dealing with trauma, this is really important. So in many cases from the project, we had a very similar trajectory when people would contact us. We'd speak over the phone or via email, often several times. Then we would meet and talk together and get to know each other. And we would talk before we ever switched on the recording device. And without that initial conversation face to face, with really simple comforting elements like water, tea, even tissues, I just wonder how many of them would have felt comfortable telling their stories. And that ritual that Emma Vickers talks about perhaps becomes even more important when you're dealing with subjects around trauma. I worry that the computer screen adds a distance that you just won't be able to overcome. Our interviewees revealed that there was expected and unexpected traumas in the lives of the narrators that we were talking to. But as the interviews progressed, it became clear that every interview would be different, and it would be based on a varying number of factors. How long it took for the interviewee to be comfortable with me and my office, how much they wanted to know about my background, how much they wanted to know about the project and the potential use of the material, how many times the interviewee would request that we stopped during the interview, how long we would talk after the microphones were switched off, and how comfortable they were with their experiences. And as a researcher, I was asking birth mothers and their children to reveal themselves to us physically and emotionally, and to trust our promise of anonymity, and in many cases, to discuss in detail the events of their lives that they had never discussed with anyone. So in these interviews, I was navigating decades of repression, secrecy, stigma, as well as the emotional repercussions of the event itself, the interview, and the years in between. So that spoke volumes, I think, about how long these women had been silenced, first by their families and their networks, but then by the stigma of their pregnancy. And so much of these oral histories was only possible through those rituals and those connections that I've talked about. It was only coming forward because of the human presence and the trust and the collaborative relationship that we built through rituals You know, they would invite me in, let me show you my garden, let me make you a cup of tea, look at pictures of my grandchildren, you know, all these things that made them feel comfortable that I worry we would lose through these platforms. So in conclusion, I have actually held off on embracing online oral history, and I'd love to know whether or not that's the case with other people. I'm really concerned about the ethical implications of moving online. I'm scared that there will be a loss of sort of a feminist approach to oral history methodologies if we're not taking the time to build that trust and have those rituals that we would perhaps create in face-to-face interviews, especially when dealing with trauma. And then finally, I suppose I ask this open question, which is, are all our oral histories now going to be pre and post COVID? Is this a big enough event in our lives that this now changes the dynamic of all of our interviews? And finally, you know, this is an idealized view. I'm very lucky in that my current project has a sort of more open-ended time frame so that I'm not constrained by that. But my previous project, that would have been a completely different situation. So, you know, obviously this is a luxury that I have. But I do think that these concerns should be listened to, and we should consider them and think about them in the strategies that we come up with, depending on how long this goes. So if we are bound by time constraints and social distancing, how can we overcome these barriers to ensure adequate connections with narrators and to ensure that they feel safe and comfortable talking with us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Livy. That was a really fantastic paper. So I think we're going to take all the questions at the end, but just, Livy, so I think there were just a couple of people who came in a bit late. Could you just perhaps very quickly just perhaps summarize the two projects that you're working on just in a few sentences for those that arrived late?
Yeah, of course. So the current project is Wastes and Strays, which is at Newcastle University, and looks at the use of urban common land and how to preserve it. And my previous project was the Northern Ireland Mother and Baby Home Project, which was kind of an oral history project about women who had been in, unmarried mother and baby homes and Magdalene laundries, specifically in Northern Ireland.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. So our next paper is going to be from Ida Milne. If her sound is working, I know you've had some problems there. Are you up and running now, Ida?
I couldn't hear Livy rather than the other way around, so I hope you can hear me now.
I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you fine. But if anyone else is having any issues, obviously just let us know through the chat. So Ida is a lecturer in European history at Carlow College. She's a former director and vice chair of ONI, and she still sits on our committee. Her publications include Stacking the Coffins, Influenza, War and Revolution in Ireland, which is published by Manchester University Press in 2018. And she also co-edited a collection of essays titled Protestant and Irish, the Minority Search for a Place in Independent Ireland. And given her research on the oral history of disease, Ida today is going to discuss the potential for oral histories of past events to contextualise modern day crises. So over to you, Ida. Great,
and thank you very much for having me on. And Olivia, I was delighted to hear your at least part of it. I get to hear the rest of it in the recording later. I'm just going to share my screen now. It's a little slow. Can you see it yet? I'm just wondering.
Oh, yeah, it's just coming up now, Ida.
Is it there? Just let me know once it's in. Is it shared? Hello? All right, and you can hear me still because I can't hear you now. It's all gone. So, I'm sure, I think it's something to do with the full screen sharing. So once it'll be fine, I'll be able to hear you again. So have been interviewing, doing oral history interviews really since 2006 on the 1918-1919 in the pandemic. I began doing for my PhD topic, and there were two PhDs in researching the same topic, and clean in Queen and really being studied for in Nash context. And about a month into it, I think academic supervisor at Trinity College Dublin, David Dixon, was beginning to despair of the idea of spending maybe 3 or 4 years in a brief window where I could oral history. And I was then very shy and quite hard to find people to introduce myself to them. But since then, I've collected about 50 oral history interviews on the pandemic. Yeah,
sorry to interrupt. Your signal's very patchy, and there's a lot of comments in the chat saying they can't hear you properly.
Okay, well, I'll have to bow out then, probably, unless I try audio only.
Without sharing either your own video or without sharing the PowerPoint.
Okay, sure. Can you hear me now? Because actually the picture is. Can you hear me better now, Arlene?
Yeah, actually, I can hear you a lot better right now.
Yeah, you sound better now. You could also try turning off your own video.
And I'll do the stop the share on the screen.
Yeah,
and
that's
just
better idea, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I was able to talk to the University of Shanghai last night without a problem, so I was hopeful. Okay, so many of my interviews in my book, Stacking the Coffins. Can you hear me okay now? Can you hear me okay now? Nobody's answering back.
Yeah, much better.
Okay. I think I'm going to bow out of this, guys, because I think it's too patchy. I think we're going to have this issue ongoing. So maybe we'll just let Cliona go ahead.
I mean, we can hear you fine. Do you want to maybe let Cliona go ahead and you can see if you can shut anything down that's in the background? Yeah. It'd be a shame for you to bow out if we can't hear you.
Ida, if you can stop your video, but we'll still hear your audio, that will probably help things. So just on the bottom left, if you just go to stop video.
Right. And okay, and interrupt them, Sam, if I don't. Okay.
Okay.
Right, back to where I was. So I've been collecting oral history since 2006 on the pandemic. And in the beginning, it was people interviewing people who had lived through the pandemic, were now in their 90s or hundreds. And back then would have been somewhere between 3 and 14 years of age. So I was fascinated about what they'd observed and how they looked back over the course of their lived lives and how the pandemic had impacted on them and what their which is interesting. When the pandemic from Wuhan emerged from Wuhan in early this year, I was fascinated by it. I was watching it and seeing that it was very much a mirror image of what had happened in 1918, 1919, how everybody was so scared of it, how they were trying to manage it, what kind of fears were about it. And I began being asked by various media to either write pieces or to be interviewed about it. So I thought it was quite interesting that at a time when in many places in the world, humanities are having issues showing the kind of impact they make, that actually this kind of scientific medical crisis was talking to my work as a humanities scholar, and that I could talk back in a way that was perceived in some quarters anyway to be relatively useful. So the first article I wrote was actually an editorial in the Irish Times on the 6th of February 2020, asking just how scared should we be of the Wuhan crisis, and talking about the panic that people had spoken to me as interviewees, and looking at how panic could be used by governments to get compliance with public health measures. my collections, later interviews were with people whose family had suffered because of it. And often this was a transgenerational experience. If you lost a parent or a grandparent, how that impacted on the lived lives. It's not just about emotional trauma. It's also about things like, you know, if your father died in the pandemic and you lose the family income. With the family, with his job, it might also go with the family home might go with it too. So it was a lot more than just an emotional loss. It was an economic loss too for many families, and a transforming experience. Generally, the interviews add the very personal experience of the pandemic. Emotions as well as individual experiences like the economics and things like that, to the official records, to the death certification, to newspapers, to institutional records that are often used to tell the flu story. Trauma wasn't always a factor, because for some interviewees, they were really only learning that they'd been part of this story when I would talk to them and tell them about the bigger flu story, and they'd say, "Oh yes, I remember having that disease when I was 5, and you know the doctor coming, but I didn't really know it was part of a bigger picture." So that was fascinating. That there were many different versions of these stories. What I really expected to hear when I began interviewing was the details of the illness, the medicines, the medical care, the immediacy of it. But instead, I found that the more interesting story was the long-term impact. And I suppose in relation to the COVID pandemic, you have to wonder what kind of implications this has for people who are either experiencing the loss through death of a family member, or where you know, a parent perhaps is left with long-term health implications, as we now know are happening to so many people, that they have fibrosis of the lungs, or that they have heart damage, or other side effects. My first interviewee was Professor R.B. McDowell, who was born in 1913 and later became a historian at Trinity. He lived in Belfast during the influenza pandemic. He caught the flu and survived, but remembered being in a kind of a febrile condition for 3 or 4 weeks when he had it, and that his doctor told his parents that he wouldn't last the night. He believes that the flu left him with a delicate constitution, and therefore had a bearing on his choice of career. And again, these are implications that could happen to people today who suffer it. He thought that, you know, that quite a lot of the family went into the bar, became barristers, or joined the army, but that this wasn't really on for him because he was delicate for several years afterwards. So he joined academia and became a historian, which is probably not an option many people would make today if they wanted a gentler career choice. If you see pictures of, really sad, I can't show it to you. He was always dressed in an overcoat, a woolly scarf, a woolly jumper, probably a tweed jacket in underneath. Even when he was walking around campus in Trinity in summer, pictures were taken of him like this. And when I introduced myself to him, he said, I said to him, "What do you do?" And he said, "Well, they tell me I'm very good for a man of my age," and proceeded to tell me his blood pressure. So he was really left with a lifelong, I suppose, not so much concern about his health as a lack of confidence in having good health, because he was always quite surprised when he had it. And I think that was a trauma that many people now will also experience, that this is, you know, the doubt about whether you're going to be healthy going forwards once you've had your health challenged. It's quite common. Another person I interviewed was Anne Burke, who told me the story of her grandfather, James Delaney, who'd been a police constable in Dublin. And he had died when he was 28 years of age. He had experienced the flu in December 1918 at the peak of the second wave, and then felt that he really should go back to work once he was a bit better, because so many of the police were down ill and they were struggling to cope, much in the same way that the police are working to help with the pandemic today, you know, delivering people to hospital and delivering medicines and things like that, as well as doing normal policing duties. Anne's father, Dennis, was 2 years of age when the police came to the door to tell the family that his father had died on the job from pneumonia in January 1918. And he was left with a lifelong fear of buttons on military uniforms or police uniforms. And you can imagine why that was when you see the perspective of a small boy looking up at that police officer who comes to the door to tell you that your beloved father has died. The family, as a result of that, the two children, he had a little sister at the time, Beck, who was just born that year. And the two children were sent off down the country for a while. And so for a short while, they lost their mother as well as their father, because she was trying to set herself up in business as a cake maker on Kimmage Cross Road in Dublin. And then they came back together and were all together. But it had a long-term impact on his mental outlook, and again he was very worried anytime his beloved only daughter would get sick from disease. So again there was that long-term impact in the confidence about health. Another story that I collected was from Claire Ablett, who was a curator in the Ulster Museum, and she told me the fascinating story of her great-grandmother's death on the Crumlin Road in Belfast on the 18th of November 1918. Her great-grandmother was Minnie Crothers. She had 4 children at the time. When she died, her husband Thomas thought it was a good idea to take their 4 children to start a new life in Canada. And so when they got there, he couldn't get work, and the children were taken into care for a time until he got a job, and then they were back together again. So they'd lost their mother and they'd lost their home, they'd lost their wider community in Belfast for reasons he was doing with the best will in the world to try and make things better for them. And then for a lot of time they lost their father too. So this had really a long-term emotional impact on the family as well. And my great thanks to Claire for sharing that story of her great-grandmother's family. In recent months, I got invited in to join a WhatsApp group called the COVID Influencers Group. It's a group of about 250 members set up by respiratory consultant Professor Oisin O'Connell. It comprises all disciplines of hospital and community medical workers, scientists like Luke O'Neill and Kim Roberts, politicians including the Minister for Health, the Chief State Medical Officer Tony Holohan, business people, journalists, and of course one historian. So my function within the group is partly to document what we're doing, but also to share knowledge of 1918, 1919. And I've found the stories of the oral histories, you know, as well. I've shared statistics and treatments and medical knowledge and other things with them, and how the government handles the crisis. But the oral history stories in particular have been of great benefit for them. So media output in this group, we focused a lot on not only sharing knowledge within the group, but also on trying to get time-sensitive messages into the newspapers and onto television and various social media. And I've been able to ground these in my research and really very often drawing on oral history interviews. One story that was told on the WhatsApp one day, one of the medical colleagues on it said how traumatizing it was when her little daughter said when she came home, "Mommy can't cook until she has her shower." And I thought this spoke very much back to my 1918 interview because well, I often spoke how old people were and how fabulous their memory was and their recall was, remembering something 90 or 100 years before. For some of them, it was 100 years before. But that I often forget that they were children at the time and how they were recording it. Many of them were 3 to 5 years of age. The oldest was 15 during the pandemic. The 15-year-old's memories are quite different. It's more like a holistic memory of the wider community and the things that happened. But for the children, it's the fear. And even though their parents often tried to hide their fears about the pandemic from children, I remember Elizabeth from Sandymount in Dublin, who told me that her parents huddled together at a cocktail party and shut up. So naturally, they ran to the newspaper. Elizabeth was of age, and she found out about that from this big scary disease event that was all over the newspapers. So children then and children now will be curious listeners. You can't keep it away from them. And all of my interviewees, did know something about it, from the attitude of parents and from the fearful look on their parents' faces, knew that something really big was happening. So I suppose I'm wondering if some of today's small children, especially the children of those medical workers I work with, be interviewed by historians of the future. And then how will their evidence differ from that of an older person interviewed today? And I think that one way that it is they're very reactive to emotions. Whereas older people tend to look more at facts and statistics or newspaper reports. One thing then I just want to discuss swiftly before I finish is the ethical question about interviewing while the crisis is still ongoing. And a few weeks back, I shared on Twitter that a body I do some work with was actually starting to do oral history interviewing. And I wasn't involved, I was just sharing their tweet. And somebody said to me, "Oh, this is too soon, a historians need to sit back. It's not history yet." But I started thinking about that, and thought very much that our understanding of the pandemic changes almost each week. Our emotional reactions to it changes each week, depending on our own circumstances, but also on how we come to view it as a society. And Charles Rosenberg, the great Harvard historian of disease, in his book Framing Epidemics, identifies 4 or 5 stages in societal understanding of the crisis common to each major infectious disease epidemic. So if we don't interview or ask people to contribute to their memory on this now, we will capture different sort of understanding, losing the immediacy. But of course, we must always collect responsibly. So many institutions and oral historians are now collecting oral history of the pandemic from different perspectives. Here, the Royal College of Physicians in Ireland is collecting medical memory of all types. Dublin City University, there's a group there collecting. The Delaney Archives, my archivist, the archivist in Carlow College where I work, is collecting, totally independent of me. And then, of course, Clina's group in UCC is doing fabulous work collecting as well. And in America, Mary Marshall Clark and Amy Stashevsky are collecting at the Columbia Oral History Center. And many other members of the Oral History Association in America are collecting already. So I think the idea of us not collecting, that's not going to happen. People are already collecting, and we will have much greater riches to understand than we had in the past. It doesn't just have an application for historians. I think it will also have applications for sociology, for psychology, or maybe for those little children of the future when they're in a nursing home 90 years from now, and they're somebody in their community is trying to understand the trauma that they suffered then, that these oral history interviews will in some way enrich that understanding. So I'll just leave it there, and thank you very much for your patience with the poor signal here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ida. Yeah, I think we got over the technological problems eventually. So yeah, sorry about that, everyone. But Ida, if you had slides, I think there was some pictures of the people you were talking about. Maybe there's a way we could share those with people later if they're interested. But sorry that the slides weren't working.
Sure.
Sorry?
I said sure, of course.
Okay, well, sorry, I think you're cutting out again, Ida. Probably. Well, anyway, we'll move on now. Ida's audio seems to have gone away. So our final speaker today is Clina O'Carroll, who's a lecturer in folklore and ethnology at UCC. and since 2010 she served as research director with the Cork Folklore Project, which is a project that collects and archives ethnographic interviews exploring life in Cork. She also directs the Cork Memory Map, which is a mapping project where the social landscapes of Cork are explored through oral history interviews. And more recently, she's initiated the Chronicles of COVID-19 collection project, which I'm sure that we'll hear about now. So I'll leave it over to you, Claire.
Thanks very much, Sam, and hi, everybody. This is a good example, really, of how we're phasing in and out of intimacy and face-to-face contact here. I'm going to share my screen, and I may turn off my talking head as well, just in case, because that will put a lot of pressure on what we're doing. So I'll just get this up for. Oh, actually, oh, I can't now that I'm sharing the screen. I must remember that. So, welcome to the final furlong. I'll gallop along, really. What I want to do is to have a quick look at what's being done in a remote manner to chronicle this particular crisis, by whom and how. But first, I want to send out a thank you, because I know that many OHNAI people have filled our Chronicles of COVID-19 questionnaire in the Cork Folklore Project. So thanks very much for that. Cork Folklore Project is a community-based folklore project affiliated with the Department of Folklore and Ethnology in UCC in Cork. It's running since 1996, and we are primarily audio. Audio interviewing is what we do. So in this presentation, I just want to kind of make a few observations really on who's been chronicling the crisis and how, and give you a sort of description and a timeline to our own People's Archive project as an example of remote interaction. A forewarning, I won't be talking about remote interviewing. So I'll be looking at the other ways that different people, different institutions, museums and so on have been interacting with this work. But some of the questions that come up are similar to those with regard to remote interviewing. Okay, so this is just for Ida, especially for Ida. I wanted to start off with some content. Like with many projects, and particularly a project carried out at a very busy time for everybody, I have managed to sort of keep our own collection project going, but have had very little chance to interact with the material because real life really does intrude. But I just picked out some references that that came out in our questionnaires with regard to the Spanish flu. One farmer in West Cork talking about how he is fearful of picking up the virus. This is COVID-19, and dying a slow, painful death, and about how he kept thinking about what his late father, as he says, told me of his two sisters that died from the Spanish flu and what awful deaths they had. The first girl, and he continues to talk about how they died. Another person talking about, a lot of people here talking about the kinds of conversations that they were having with older generations about things like the Spanish flu, their own memories of polio epidemics in Cork. And indeed, we added extra sections into our questionnaire on the prompting of people who said, oh, it would be lovely to, if you asked about other life experiences that people were reminded of. So I've just put those up specially for Ida there, also because it's terrible to talk and talk without giving some kind of an idea of the kind of content that a project is coming up with. So just an idea of when I started looking at what we might do, had a quick look around, who's chronicling the crisis? Everybody and their mother, it seems. Archives, oral historians, public historians, artists, libraries, museums, individuals, and of course broadcasters and journalists who are also putting out calls for people to interact with them about their everyday experiences. The broadcasters and journalists I put in a slightly different category here, and my big question there is what happens to what ends up on the cutting room floor. But, and this is of course chronicling from an everyday perspective. It kind of seems like everybody's at it. There are a couple of different ways that people were engaging as well that I noticed in my brief forays around the place. The most basic maybe would be through observation and documentation in the real world and online. A couple of examples there, people gathering memes, photographing the situation in supermarkets and so on. Another area would be for people to asking people to submit stuff, images, diaries, creative responses. And these systems can range from anything to a request to kind of send us anything at all by email, to more structured choices of material and ways to upload. And I do wonder sometimes when I see very open calls, how many people will actually sit down and create something, maybe an audio piece or a video piece, text, then save it, and give a bit of context about themselves along with permissions and send it off. I think when people start to look at gathering material remotely through call outs or crowdsourcing, there is always a tension there between creating a system where people can share in a few clicks, social media styly, and creating something which is more involved, but which fewer people will have the time or the capacity or the inclination or the resources to engage with. And that tension is very much there all the time. One thing's for sure, I think just creating a platform or sending out a call isn't likely to result in more than a few entries. And here, just like with remote interviewing, it's just the same as the rest of our work. There has to be actual engagement with actual people or existing relationships in order to, in this case, kind of get a good number or a good spread of people involved in projects like this. So a few examples of these crowdsourcing projects. There's the Digital Archives of Latvian Folklore. They have a Diaries in the Time of Pandemic project. The Limerick Museums came together and sent out a request for people to email in responses in different formats to them with a view of creating an exhibition at the end of it. City Lore in New York City, they were looking for more creative responses. The Finnish Literature Society, here we can see on this slide a fairly a very well structured archival approach to documenting the context of the material. Images, of course. This project in street and urban art mapping is mapping COVID-19 street art, but also has recently put out a call to map George Floyd and anti-racist street art. And they're looking for this kind of street art from all over the world, in case anybody is interested. The Elphinstone Institute Archives in the University of Aberdeen, they have a lockdown lore collection which looks for handcrafted responses, stories, songs, tunes, poems, and digital initiatives. Just to finish up there, sorry. Then we've got the idea of remote interviewing. We'll skip on from that for a little while. And questionnaire type collection, like say the Norwegian Folk Museum, the Swedish Folk Museums, and so on. There are a few questions that come up with this kind of collection. And my first is this idea of whether we're creating potentially an overabundance of material, particularly if it's context poor. Questions about, with this huge explosion of documentation of the crisis, how will we know what's out there in the future? How much of this stuff will actually be accessible in the future? And conversations more generally then about crisis-related collection express both enthusiasm and caution. But all of these points have been mentioned already today, and they're things that we're all thinking about quite a lot these days. I suppose on the side of enthusiasm, the point that documenting reactions and reflections while they're fresh can really help us to capture elements that might be sidelined by media accounts or official accounts, by archival memory, elements that we don't remember really all that actively when we know how the story ends. So here we're really talking about the freshness and emotional resonance of in the moment reactions. And of course, sharing stories and reflection can be positive for people in terms of meaning making and making sense of experience. That has to be said with a caveat. It would be stupid to think that the experience is always positive and always necessarily positive, and always necessarily in some way healing or helpful for people who engage with us. But certainly this idea of collecting or interacting with people to document everyday experiences while they're fresh, they have huge potentials and implications, particularly in research on crisis, but also in terms of providing materials for social advocacy. Just thinking in terms of creating a record of how Irish travellers are experiencing the crisis, as they experience it very differently to the rest of the population, particularly because of a lack of access to resources. So this kind of material and the hopes and fears that people express at the time can be used as a resource in all sorts of ways that we may not imagine yet, but may provide a very useful counterstream, I suppose, to the kind of codified story that accrues over time. Okay, then the notes of caution. One question: who are we to ask people for their time and their contribution when they're in a state of upheaval, of worry or stress? This brings up a lot of ethical questions. Some would argue that allowing a coherent narrative to emerge before engaging with people is a more ethical approach. And anybody who talks about this kind of thing does really send up flares in terms of looking out for welfare of contributors, but also researchers who in this particular context or in any context of crisis have their own worries, preoccupations and ongoing issues. An interesting book that documents and discusses this kind of thing is Listening on the Edge: Oral History in the Aftermath of Crisis. And I notice as well that the Norwegian museums are having a fairly robust discussion about the ethics of crisis documentation. Okay, on to the Cork Folklore Project's approach. Audio interviewing is our main activity. So of course we had a few choices to make in terms of whether we were going to continue collecting, whether we'd shift our documentation of everyday life with its challenges and creative responses and reflections online. We wanted to document the way our lives have changed so fundamentally and so quickly, and our reactions to and reflections on the shift. But audio interviewing is what we do. So we kind of had to, we had to decide how we might approach this. For many reasons, we couldn't continue interviewing remotely, or chose not to, not least that our project researchers are in community employment schemes and were in a hiatus of work at that time, weren't actually working. So we made an open call for text and audio and images. However, we didn't have an easy to use platform for submission. So we invited people to email us submissions, asked our researchers to take photos, and we asked volunteers who were already working with us to do the same and to keep regular audio diaries. And thank you, Pauline Matthews, who's here, who's faithfully documented the timeline for us through the prism of our own experience. We also created an online questionnaire. And when I say we here, it's mainly myself and Jamie Fury, our sometimes digital archivist, when we have the resources to employ him, who carried out this work. Questionnaires. So I'll just put up a slide here which gives the general areas covered. It's questionnaires, qualitative questionnaires are really tricky. It's very hard to draft something that balances openness with giving enough direction. Tradition archives are no strangers to the use of questionnaires alongside interviewing, particularly in Northern Europe. The Irish National Folklore Collection made good use of questionnaires on everything from straw hay and rushes through the care of the feet to via the banshee and house luck. Our Nordic Baltic colleagues still have the use of respondent questionnaires as quite a core part of their practice. I have to come clean and admit that I always viewed questionnaires as a very poor relation of the face-to-face interview. And I wondered in some cases how they could approach anything at all like the same richness as interviews and whether they were worthwhile at all. Now I do have occasion to eat my words because of the deep detail, the thoughtfulness, the surprises, the hope, the sadness, the humor that we came across in the materials submitted to us, and also the view into other people's lives that we got. For example, what it's like to live your life, your everyday life as someone who's extremely medically vulnerable in the early days of COVID-19. So all of this made me realize somewhat shamefacedly that how the use of questionnaires can be very worthwhile, particularly in these kinds of circumstances. So quick timeline there. We drafted a questionnaire probably late April when I was finished with university work that was pressing. Put it in for the Social Research Ethics Board in UCC, got approval on the 7th of April. We released it, and then we didn't just sit back, because here's where the relationships come in. We promoted it personally through emails, social media, did radio and television interviews. We drafted an Irish language questionnaire as well, Keshnor, and made that available. And then we realized that a print form would be particularly useful to people who wouldn't have access to the online questionnaire, or who preferred working maybe on their computers or in with handwriting. So this version was developed with a view to giving people who wanted to work with family members or with people who are close to them. And also then people started contacting us looking for ways to use the questionnaire to combat social isolation. So Farranree Community Centre, and I'll hop on here, they got some support to use our printed questionnaires and distribute them with the Meals on Wheels. So we haven't actually gotten access to our building, but I expect numbers of printed questionnaires that people would answer on their or engage with on their own paper to be waiting for us when we get back in there. And indeed, they want to talk to us about further collaboration. And other initiatives now are getting in contact with us, lockdown arts projects and so on. A lot of people have been engaging in a lot of very creative projects, impromptu projects like collaborative songwriting, lockdown songwriting workshops and so on, and are looking perhaps for places then to make sure that their work is safeguarded or recognized in the future. So by mid-May, we had about 100 responses to the questionnaire and smaller numbers of responses by email. We hit a wall. We absolutely hit a wall at some point with a lot of intensive work to pull this together, more intensive work to try to promote it. with very few people doing the work, and all of us with caring duties. So one of the things that I would say very strongly, and I'd be very interested in trying to quantify, is to make sure that anybody thinking of doing projects like this have an opportunity through maybe process documentation from other archives to understand how much work and how many resources do go into projects like this. Because of course, once you set the ball in motion, there is an ethical and responsibility and a duty of care to continue to interact with people whose attention you've caught, and whose experiences and who've shared their experiences with you. So just another few points. Sorry, I'm just trying to get this to work. One observation that I'd have is that my suspicions were confirmed looking at all of this, our own experience and that of others, that the easier it is to collect, the more difficult it is to archive or share or reuse or contextualize material. This is evident with, say, people collecting memes. It's grand to have the low quality image, but timelines and sharing paths and interactions around them are much, much harder to get an idea of for long-term archiving. And the same goes for images and text and audio and video. If you want to get permissions for archiving and sharing, if you want to work through informed consent properly, then the process needs to be relatively slow and considered. And it will in no means sort of reflect on a one-to-one basis the experience that people have when sharing on social media. Some surprises arising from our own experience. Really, I was floored by the richness of the material submitted and the way it brought you into people's worlds. There was a good bit of immediate benefit expressed here, and I'll just give you some quotations there. One extremely medically vulnerable person said that it was actually a great experience, so important to put some shape on our experiences, thanks so much. Another participant, we did ask people, by the way, if they thought that there was anything we could add, or for their feedback on the actual experience of filling out the questionnaire as well. So these are responses to that inquiry. So from another participant, I think this survey is a brilliant idea. It's already helped me to write about how I'm feeling, and well done to you for thinking it up. I don't want to forget about what's happened. I want to keep feeling that it must change our society for the better once we're back in action, and back in action we will be for sure. So there's some evidence that, that some people, these are the ones of course who made it to press submit, made it the whole way along that road, did find it as a positive experience. Unexpected partnerships came out of it, people who came to us looking to use the questionnaire in social inclusion initiatives, in neighbourhood and community initiatives. And we drew on existing partnerships to ask, let's say, the Cork Women's Traveller Network to become involved in the project, to make sure that different experiences were represented. And I do think that any project like this could not be engaged in without drawing on and being prepared to develop relationships all through it. And a last point does include the fact that if anybody's thinking of doing something like this, you've got to know that you'll be able to stick with it. No matter how small it seems, it's a fairly big job. And if there's anything oral historians have a good understanding of, is that we can't stop once we've started, and that we can't stop once we've started, and that our commitment is long-term, in no matter what kind of project. So from my perspective, I saw such an undertaking, let's say the use of questionnaires or the crowdsourcing of material, as something qualitatively different to face-to-face interviewing, from the point of view of the kind of material that you generate, and from the point of view of maybe the operational relationships. But now I'd conclude really that that difference isn't so great. And at the end, in the heel of the reel, it is indeed all about relationships and all about being human in the world and making our choices as to how we can engage best in the situations that we find ourselves in. Okay, I'll finish on that and I will give the screen back. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Kina, for another fascinating paper. Yeah, I think it's absolutely a fantastic range of papers covering different topics, and I'd just like to thank all our speakers again for their papers.